All right, enlightenment. Now, part of the reason for this is again the pendulum. The Enlightenment was a period of religious skepticism and turning away from God and a turning away from Christianity. The Romantic era was a turning back to Christianity. And it was the people then were more religious than the Enlightenment people had been. Religious skepticism was not as strong as it had been. Also, there were a lot of revivals during the Romantic period that had not been going on always during the Enlightenment period, but there were a lot of revivals. Now, some of the literature I want you to remember from the Romantic period. Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was an American author, only lived to be about 41 years old, and died of heart failure. You might say, how come he didn't live longer? He was a drug abuser, alcohol abuser. He was the first person to envision pink elephants, pink little elephants on the wall. And in his works, a lot of what he wrote was written while he was under the influence of drugs. Now, I have been told with some students that some teachers teach it. This is not true. If you've heard it's not true, your input is welcome. But it appears to me from my studies that he wrote while he was under the influence of drugs, and it shows up in his works. Some people say, well, the drugs made him reach heights he otherwise would not have reached had he been sane and sober. I think the man would have been better off had he stayed sane and sober, but he gave himself to drugs, and as a result, he did not live long. His most famous work was The Fall of the House of Usher, about a big, magnificent mansion that was now in ruins and nobody lived there anymore. It was unsafe to go to, and how that it had once been mighty and strong. Fall of the House of Usher.
More famous than The Raven?
More famous. Maybe The Raven is more famous. I don't know. I'm not an expert on literature to say these, but I have run into Poe, and I have studied Edgar Allan Poe a little bit. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. There are persons who have studied the psychology of Shelley, what would inspire her to write that, and they say she came from a home where her father was extremely cruel and extremely strict, and that the Frankenstein monster was really her father, and that the Frankenstein monster that she created had a lot of resemblance to her father, at least in her mind. Now again, some of you might actually know more about the subject than I do, but this is some of what I've done with, what I've come across with very little research. Beethoven, oh yes. Now some of you might have, Beethoven had a problem that is a real problem for a musician. What was his big problem? He was deaf. He was deaf, thank you. He was deaf, yes. And he had to tell the people he talked to, please shout, I'm deaf. But nevertheless, in spite of that handicap, he became a composer, and today they did not have hearing aids in those days, even though they did have the big horn that a deaf person could use that would enable a person to hear a little bit better. But the small electronic hearing aid was to come later. Beethoven, famous composer. All right, I know I've mentioned this man, but in this time period also, Pasteur. He discovered that germs cause disease. Very important, because this meant that people learned you better eat from clean dishes. Oh yeah, the common drinking cup, where everybody go to a well and everybody would pump water from the well and drink from the same cup. This practice was outlawed, thanks to Louis Pasteur. He discovered that these germs could be killed by boiling, cooking. I don't think any disease germ can survive boiling water for any length of time. Now some of them can survive up to 180 degrees or even 190, but not many. But now, oh yes, Mendeleev. he worked with chemistry, and if you, I'm sure you won't study chemistry without running into this man. He led the way for the formation of the periodic table. Now, if you go to any chemistry class here, you'll see the periodic table of the elements. And at Lockheed, we had several of them posted at various labs in the plant. I've heard that if you're going to be a chemistry major, you have to memorize the table. I don't know if that's always true or not, as some of you might know. But he said he decided that the base element at the bottom of the list, the first element was hydrogen, and then next up was helium, and then next up from that was lithium. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Okay, a few of you do, yes, etc., etc. And then he said some of these elements were inert, that is, they can't be mixed with any other element. And then one example of an inert element is nitrogen, I believe, and I'm not sure, all of a sudden anyway, some elements can't mix with others, and some can. But he helped pave the way for chemical mixtures that led to new discoveries in chemicals, plastics, steel, better methods of doing metallurgy. Michael Faraday, oh yes, Faraday, his work led to the development of the generator. Now, it took 50 years for mankind to develop a good generator, and if you ever studied electric generators, you know why, because the generator would tend to generate eddy currents or counter currents, or it basically would oppose itself. But he learned, and eventually it took 50 years, but mankind learned how to generate electricity by turning a coil in a magnetic field. Hopefully some of you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, okay, turning a coil in a magnetic field and generating electricity. Every automobile that you see, except for the electric cars, has a generator inside it. It's now called an alternator. Every airplane has them, every boat, every ship has one. Again, thanks to the work of Michael Faraday. Now, science then made a whole lot of strides, and science came to be looked on as being the source of all knowledge, and the scientific method became known as being the only way to arrive at truth. Now, folks, this is not considered true anymore. We found a lot of things in the universe that simply does not lend itself to science. And I was just listening to a YouTube video last night about the quantum, and somebody said everything we believed about quantum theory is all wrong. I mean, I've heard that off and on for more than 40 years, that quantum mechanics, science is a bunch of malarkey, that we've gone off in the wrong direction. Be that as it may, something else about science, it's like anything else, it's subject to interpretation. And I was on it too, well, me and another man, we're looking at a weather report, and my weather report called for rain, the one he was looking at called for sunshine, but they both came to the same source, the National Weather Service. But he was using a different computer, I was using Microsoft Network. Mine turned out to be right, but I'm sure half the time his is right. But again, look at the same data, coming up with different conclusions. So again, the scientific method has its limitations, and its limitations are humanity itself. All right. Now, this brings me up to maybe one of my favorite topics. Now, you might be familiar with Charles Darwin. He's famous for his theory of evolution. In 1859, he wrote a book, Now, you may have heard that the title of the book is The Origin of Species. That's only partially correct. You might have, if you dug deeper, learned that the title of the book was On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. No, that's a little bit more correct, but here's what the real title was. On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection for the Preservation and Enhancement of the Favored Races. What he was doing, folk, and the word race did not come into man's vocabulary until him. He was saying that some races were better than others, and some races were evolved more than others, and therefore it was our duty of mankind to somehow promote the preservation and enhancement of the better races. And then, folk, this is a sad part, at the expense of the less favored races. Folk, he actually did. Now, hey, I don't believe a word of it, you know. I mean, there's no such thing as a favored race. In fact, there are no races as such. There is only one race, and that's a human race. Some years back, I had my DNA tested. I'm of haplogroup R1b, which most Western Europeans are. In 1986, mankind made a huge discovery that all human beings, well, first of all, it was with women, that all human women alive today are descended from one woman. Now, does anyone know what they call this woman?
Lucy.
Not Lucy. Lucy is an ape. I mean, Lucy. They called her from a book that's forbidden in today's public schools. The name.
Well, Eve.
Eve. They called this woman Eve. Yeah, I don't know where they got that name. It has to do. Then they discovered shortly in the same year that all human males are descended from one man. They call this man Adam. Or Adam. Well, they said that, well, Eve lived some 200,000 years ago and Adam 60,000. All right, now, you might ask, well, how come Adam lived so much sooner than Eve? Well, folk, every human alive has heard of a story of a big catastrophe that destroyed everybody except for one man and this man's 3 sons and their wives. It's called the flood story.
No.
The flood story is actually written in our DNA, but it's also written in every language of the earth that has a written language. The flood story is universal. It's told by every small group, every large group, every nation on the face of the earth has a flood story. And it turns out it's written in our DNA. Apparently, the wives of the 3 sons were not related. That's why the female DNA goes farther. The Eve that all females descend from goes farther back than Adam. Again, there's no such thing as a favored race. Now, Darwin did not know this. With all respect to Darwin, he did not know about DNA. In fact, when DNA was first seen by an electron microscope in the 1930s, they called the word A in DNA stands for acid. It was just some little acid, you know, that's in a cell. Then they discovered it has everything to do with heredity. All right, DNA and heredity. DNA actually disproves Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. DNA helps guarantee that all species will only reproduce their own species. In other words, felines only reproduce felines. Canines only produce canines. Equines only produce equines. Well, you might say, but what about the differences between a horse and a zebra? Hey, yeah, I know. Horse and zebra, but horses and zebras, I don't know, had the same ancestors. All right, but I did not bring a deck of cards with me, but you can use that as an example. If you're playing a deck of bridge cards, you might draw an ace of hearts and an ace of diamonds and maybe 5 or 6 other heart cards, and you think, hey, I've got a good hand. I've got the ace of hearts and I've got 6 heart cards. The next hand you draw would be a different hand. Well, basically what I'm saying is zebras, and your horses drew a different hand from the same deck. Each of you, all of us, are slightly different. We drew from the same deck, folk. Some of us are black skinned, brown skinned, some of us are white skinned, some of us are in between, but we all drew from the same deck. Human beings are more alike than any other species that overspreads the globe. Sexual reproduction helps to promote differentiation. But does that lead to evolution? No, sexual reproduction also limits the differentiation to guarantee that the differentiation will only stay within certain boundaries and never transgress, no matter how hard you try. Now, for instance, horse racing. I just read that every horse that has won in a tournament, that ever races in a tournament these days, they sent from one horse that was born in 1700. Do they ever breed a race of super horses? No. Now, one of the best horses that ever raced was a horse named Secretariat. Oh, he was a good one. He was fast. He was really fast. But his descendants, he had some 500, you might say, horses that he fathered. Only one of them ever won a race. What happened is then they went back to the mainstream of horses. They did not evolve into a race of super horses that have wings and... All right. Hey. In order for, let's say, in order for a cat to become a dog, the DNA, the genes on a cat would have to move from one chromosome to another. Let's say this one. Now, I'm about to ask a question you've probably never been asked before. How does a gene move from one chromosome to another? I'll give you a hint. I don't know. But if one ever did, the creature, that an offspring would be completely, totally, thoroughly deformed. And unless it met with another member, another cat that had the same type of genetic defect, the line will end with that line. Bang. That's the end of the line. In other words, if a cat, for a cat to become a dog, this cat would have to have millions of genetic changes. In the case of humans, in order for a pair of chimps, which is now believed to be the nearest relatives of humans, in order for a chimp to become a human, it couldn't happen over a long period of time. It would have to be all of a sudden two chimps one day would have had to have had one child, a human child. There would have had to have been at least 40 million molecular changes to the DNA, including genes moving from different places on the same chromosome, one chromosome to another. And then, if that's not impossible, there would have to be a member of the opposite sex that had the same deformation. The same genes move to the same locations on its DNA. Now, does that make sense to you? In order for humans to reproduce other humans, you have, of course, one male and one female. And the male and female, all the genes, all right. This you learn in your biology class. The DNA splits in two. The spiral DNA with half the DNA and the other half. Well, when they come together again, during sexual reproduction, each chromosome lines up with its counterpart. Well, what if a chromosome that's supposed to be here is down here? You can't have a mix. This is fundamental biology. Yes?
Bringing up the last point you made, though, about how you think quantum is all a bunch of malarkey.
Yeah.
What if this is all a bunch of malarkey? We figure out
Well,
something else.
Here's the thing, though. I believe we're more accurate with our DNA studies than we are with quantum studies. I believe that DNA studies are accurate. We're so slowly mapping the human DNA and then mapping the chimp DNA.
Yes, my point was more.
But now, all these things can be, down the road, be completely disproven and laughed at. That could happen.
Right.
That could happen. But with what we present, now I'll say about Darwin, every generation has been able to refute him. But by 1960, They told us we have to accept it. Evolution is fact, evolution is proven, it's known. Then the last 59 years or so have not been at all kind to the theory. A movement, the creationist movement has come along, and they have raised questions that even the evolutionists admit they don't have an answer to. All right, now, I watched airplanes. I watched a big C-5 being put together on Lockheed. You can put a C-5 together by one crew over here doing this and another crew doing that, and at the end of the workday, they all clock out and go home. How do you put together a living cell? If you don't get the cell together in an instant and get the process, there's one thing, all right, the C-5 was made for a process. Well, you put the C-5 together, you didn't start the processes right away because, you had to check it out first. The process, it goes off in the air and flies. That's the process. Every device you build is built for a process, folk. This, built for a process. By the way, I turned the thing off before the class started, so it won't go off. But it's built for a process. But with the case of a living cell, if you don't have the processes going, the thing will decompose. You have to get the processes started right. The thing has to come together right now, and the processes have to. Now, I was told once, hey, you're not teaching science, you're teaching theology. Folk, I believe I'm on scientific firm ground here. How can you get more than a billion atoms in the right place, the right time, and immediately the processes start to where the first cell will not decompose? I once heard it put this way: the number of known atoms in the universe is 10 to the 91st power. The chances of a cell coming together is 10 to the 10. In other words, keep in mind, 10 to the 92nd power is 10 times greater than 10 to the 91st. Do all of you know enough math to follow what I'm doing? 10 to the 93rd power is 100 times greater. But 10 to the 1024 power, that is millions of times bigger than all the known atoms in the universe. The odds that a cell could just come together by itself and function and then reproduce. See, what do I mean by the process? The processes are, it's got to grow, it's got to reproduce, it's got to take in food, it's got to respirate, it's got to excrete waste, it's got to respond to stimuli. That's what it takes to be alive. And those processes have to start immediately. All right, now, leaving that to the scientific, I want to get to some of the practical aspects of Darwin. Darwin was debated extensively. He was used as justification for the rich crushing the poor. Now, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller used Darwin as an excuse. I know there was another one. Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel. They used Darwin as an excuse for crushing the poor. Rockefeller sat in a Sunday school class at a Methodist church and said, what I did was what every farmer does. You plant a bunch of tomatoes, and then when the tomatoes spring up, you go and look at them, you pull up the weak ones and kill the weak ones. He said, that's what I did. In other words, to promote the best, he said, you have to crush the weak.
Is that called social Darwinism?
Excellent, excellent. Go to the head of the class. No, you're already there anyway. Excellent. Social Darwinism, that it's morally justifiable to just go in and crush the person who's weaker than you and make yourself stronger. And don't help the poor, don't help the weak, don't, because this is promoting the worst of you. So this is called social Darwinism. And then it justified Adolf Hitler to kill hopefully all of you heard Adolf Hitler killed 6 million Jews on the grounds that they were racially inferior, and by eliminating the Jewish population, he would promote mankind to the next high level. What you may not know is that he sterilized every black person he could get his hands on to make sure that the black race, as much as he could, did not repopulate themselves. And I've had black men write papers that are favorable toward Adolf Hitler. Now, folk, you can check this out. I'm not making this up. Yeah, he sterilized, and then Adolf Hitler had to sit in the stands during the 1936 Olympic in Munich and watch In the stands is a black runner named Jesse Owen. I see a few persons know outran. I mean, even though Jesse Owen was black, he made the Olympic team because he outran every race he ran. I mean, he outran his fellow competitors. So the United States sent the Olympics. Fine, they should have. He deserved it. He earned it. And then there at Olympic, he outran all those superior Aryan white runners that Hitler saw. And all Hitler could do was just stand and watch. Hitler also had to watch as a black boxer. Now, the German champion was a man named Max Schmeling. And Schmeling whipped Lewis in the first match. But it was a close enough match, it's decided to have a rematch. In the rematch, Joe Louis won. So they matched the third time. In the third match, Joe Louis. You may know this, Joe Louis was a black man who defeated one of those white Aryan super race people. But again, the concept of race was not known until Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809. I'm not going to write that down, but another famous American was born that date. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Both men were born on the same day, February 12th, 1809, and both men dealt with the subject of race. Lincoln in a much different way. Lincoln by freeing the slaves and promoting the black people. Darwin by convincing the world that the blacks were inferior. Now again, there was a time when it could be believed that that black people were closer related to the apes than the whites were. And there was an attempt made to mate a human female with an ape. No black woman would volunteer, and finally the French government moved in and stopped the experiment. But this actually was proposed, that we see what we could get. Now, anyway, this business of intermixing the species, though, has been done experimentally. That's another topic. Now, all right. Anybody have any comments now? I mean, I've done a lot of the talking, but if any of you have any insights, if you haven't guessed, I'm strongly anti-evolution. I blame evolution for a lot of the problems that this country, this world had after Darwin's time. And as time has gone on, it has not proven evolution. In fact, proven evolution is becoming seemingly more and more impossible. Now again, what might come about? Oh yes, something else. With all respect, all right, Darwin had to use 1859 microscopes. If you look at it with an 1859 microscope, let's say this is a human cell, and this is a cell from a white rabbit with pink eyes. They look alike. Look very much alike. Now actually though, we know that this cell, if allowed to grow up, will become a white rabbit with pink eyes, and this will become a human being. So they're not alike. And the bigger you get in the magnification, the less and less these two look alike. You start seeing the differences. But and also Charles Darwin believed, and for many, I mean, even as recently as the 1950s, we were taught this, that one-celled plants and animals were simple life forms. If you actually study it, you will see that there is nothing simple about it. A cell is so complex that we cannot even begin to put it together, consisting of more than 1 billion of atoms that work together in a type of harmony that we cannot even begin to duplicate. I'm not saying we never will, but I'm saying at the moment we can't begin to duplicate. There is nothing simple about any life. The gap, all right, evolution is full of huge, but one of the big gaps is the gap between human and other animals. But another gap is the gap between living and non-living. That gap is too wide, folk. Altogether too wide. All right. Again, anybody want to? Okay, Darwin believed out of natural selection, the strong eat up the weak, and the strong survive and the weak die. Now, I must elaborate on this a little bit. Natural selection, for instance, in the case of rabbits, any rabbit born in the wild has only 1 chance in 10 of living for 1 year. Well, supposing you have a rabbit that is more fit than others, its chances are only 0.11. A rabbit that might be less fit, its chances are 0.09.